Hi, I'm Andrew Hilton. I'm the director of the Centre for the Study of Financial Innovation, which for the last 6 weeks has been in virtual lockdown. We've been trying to do what we normally do, which is a series of roundtables on issues of current interest, but to do them virtually. This is the 26th meeting of our Financial Sustainability for Breakfast group. As always, it is anchored by Ben Caldecott, the founding director of the Oxford Sustainable Finance Programme at Oxford University's Smith School, a senior advisor to the UK's Green Finance Initiative, a visiting researcher at the Turing Institute, an academic visitor at the Bank of England, a visiting scholar at Stanford, and many, many other things. This month we have two very distinguished other panelists, Lord Barker, Greg Barker, who, as Greg Barker, was the MP for Bexhill and Battle and was also the Minister of State for Climate Change and Energy. He is now the chairman of N+, the largest independent hydroelectric power generator in the world, but also heavily involved in bauxite and alumina mining from Guinea to Guyana. It's a big company with a big footprint in the environmental area. Louise Dudley is a portfolio manager at Federated Hermes, as we now have to call it. It changed its name from Hermes to Federated Hermes in February to reflect the fact that it has now incorporated into the Federated family of fund managers in the US, which manages $642 billion. And the ESG element of that is, I guess, dominant. I was actually listening to the quarterly earnings call from Mr. Donoghue only this morning, and certainly looks quite promising despite the lockdown that we all find ourselves in. So can I ask, first of all, Lord Barker and Louise, just to say a little bit about what they're up to and how they view the future of the ESG area, climate change issues, and I guess really in particular, Lord Barker, how N+, which after all is a Russian-owned company, fits into the ESG space. Lord Barker.
Thank you. Good morning, Andrew, and delighted to take part in this virtual breakfast. The key mission for N+ at the moment, like every other major organisation around the world, is the health and safety of our employees and the communities in which we operate. For the N+ group, that is a pretty big responsibility. We employ over 100,000 people in a dozen countries on 5 continents. So we really do have a global footprint, a very large workforce that we take responsibility for. Like thousands of others of my colleagues, I'm now working from home, but we have many thousands of other colleagues who continue to keep essential services going as both an industrial producer of vital economic building blocks for the economy generally, but also as you said in your introduction, as a major producer of power and supplier of heat and electricity in Russia, in particular in Siberia. And I'm very grateful particularly to those colleagues who are not just observing the health and safety regulations, but particularly those who are continuing to keep the wheels of the N+ group turning. But in terms of ESG and the low carbon agenda, this is something that, despite the crisis, we are determined not to be sidetracked from. And before this terrible COVID crisis began, we had already been really putting our shoulder to the climate agenda, particularly for our sector. We hear a lot about in the UK about big companies that have signed up to the climate agenda, but all too often, many of the leaders have been those without a large industrial footprint, financial services, which is great, or light industrial companies. The real challenge in the 2020s I think, for the global economy and the decarbonisation is those 7 hard-to-abate industrial sectors. They are the meat of the high-emitting carbon economy. And that's the oil and gas, the transport and aviation sectors, iron, steel, cement, but also my own sector, aluminium. And we are really driving ahead, trying to show some leadership there and to bring our sector together to focus on the decarbonisation goals that will align our sector with the science-based targets that were adopted at Paris. So we are playing an important role there. We are not just the largest producer of aluminium outside of China, so a big global producer, but we're actually the world's lowest carbon producer of aluminium. To put that in some context, globally, aluminium, particularly that from China, can have a carbon footprint of typically 18 tons of carbon for a ton of aluminium produced. For N+, it's under 3. So 18 versus 3. But we've still got to get that down to net zero. So we are focused on the technologies that will help us drive that, on the collaboration of making a market for low carbon aluminium so that the externalities of carbon pollution are priced into the product, which is why we're working with the London Metal Exchange to try and produce a new asset class of low carbon aluminium, why we're working with the European Union to try and bring greater visibility so that when people are making purchasing decisions, they realize that aluminium, which in itself is incredibly sustainable because it's recyclable. To put some facts on that, about 75% of all the aluminium that's been produced in the modern industrial era is still in circulation. So it's the antithesis of throwaway plastics. Aluminium really is one of the precursors of the circular economy. Very important building block for a low carbon economy, but it's got to be made sustainable. So that is our real focus. But I am aware that the ESG agenda goes much wider than just climate, which is why we've been reporting on a whole range of ESG metrics, but perhaps I'll save those for now.
Okay. Great. I just want to say one small thing. One of your projects in Guinea is a thing called Frigia. Many, many, many years ago, I did a survey for the World Bank, a mineral sector survey of Guinea. I was flown around the country. I found 10 projects in Guinea for the World Bank. Number 1 was Frigia, which needed just a small amount of money to turn itself from a disaster into a success. The bank chose to fund the number 10 one, an iron ore project, which still isn't working. Louise Dudley, tell us what's happening at Federated Hermes, as we now call it.
Sure. Good morning. Thank you. Delighted to be here contributing to this panel. I'll just talk a little bit in terms of obviously what we've seen so far year to date. So certainly, obviously, within the markets, things have been very volatile. And so, the start of the year started really very extreme in terms of where things might go, and expectations were quite strong in terms of the global economy. And certainly the resolution of the trade war that we saw meant that we were quite bullish from an equity perspective in terms of where things might go. And as the development of the COVID crisis has come in, it's obviously reset a lot of plans. But certainly within Federated Hermes, where we have very much a longer term agenda in terms of all the investment products that we have, whether it is in listed equities as I work, or within the private markets assets as well. So very much kind of looking at the kind of the longer term trends and certainly how COVID has changed some of those shorter term metrics. Some of the things that have been quite important for us, particularly within the stewardship and engagement work that we do. So within Federated Hermes, we've got one of the kind of most well-resourced engagement teams, talking to companies across industries, across regions, in terms of what they're doing on ESG and what they're doing in terms of thinking holistically about their business. And I think certainly that's been a trend that has really come to the fore as businesses have been even more so, even though they were kind of already on that journey, taking more of these wider stakeholder groups into account within their businesses. I think COVID has really accelerated that journey. And so as part of the engagement that we do with companies, we've been talking to them about what they can do both kind of immediately in terms of kind of shoring up the business plans that they have and how they're treating staff. And obviously that remains a lot of businesses at the kind of forefront of their mind, but also kind of longer term, what this means in terms of the priorities of their business. And certainly we've seen a big range of actions from different companies, but we're looking to be supportive of businesses through this time. And so I think there's been kind of quite a strong track of what we've seen so far year to date. But also keeping in mind, particularly on the environmental side, obviously COP being delayed, but that climate change really is still very much on the agenda for businesses. We are seeing obviously a change in terms of home working, a lot of shutdown of industries, but what that means in terms of going forward. So the additional reliance on technology and what that means in terms of businesses being able to capture maybe some of those savings, but also some of the environmental benefits as well, and how they can build that into their strategy. So those are some of the things that we've been thinking about so far.
Right, great. Well, look, Ben, what have you been up to? What's on your agenda? And can I urge Lord Barker and Louise to cut in and say where Ben is right, where he's wrong, where he's missed something. Ben Caldecott.
Sure, thanks, Andrew, and it's great to be part of this 26th breakfast and our second virtual one. I guess for the last, we recorded the last one on the 31st of March. I've been mainly at this desk working, like many people, and it's actually been remarkably busy. But as usual, I'll just go through some of the things that have happened in a chronological order. So the thing that was announced the day after we recorded the last one was, as Louise said, COP26 postponement. So the dates in November 2020 will now be pushed into 2021. We don't know when in 2021. That should be confirmed in the next few months.
Will it still be the UK?
Yeah, it'll still be in the UK. It'll still be Glasgow. It'll just be 2021. Hopefully, hopefully summer months. I'd rather be in Glasgow in the summer than in November 2021. But anyway, we'll find out in a couple of months about that decision.
So substantively, does that change anything in terms of the COP agenda?
It gives everyone more time, obviously, and that's valuable. Because
I'd say one of the things that is particularly helpful is that while no one wants to see the COP put back, but in actual fact, by having it in 2021, there is a potential to align it when the UK actually takes the chair of both the G7 and the G20. So the UK will have a lot more international leverage than just the COP chairmanship next year. So there could be a wonderful coming together of influence and leverage.
That is a triple whammy that I hadn't actually realized. Saudi Arabia currently has the chairmanship of the G20.
So it'll be Italy that has the chairmanship of the G20 next year. We have the chairmanship of the G7. So, but Italy are co-hosting.
We're not joint sharing?
So UK and Italy are doing COP. Italy as kind of co-hosts or partners to the COP process, but Italy have the chair of the G20 and we have the chair of the G7 next year. But your point still stands, right? Which is that, if you've got both countries organising the COP with those presidencies, that's a big deal. And of course, the recovery agenda opens up all sorts of opportunities to accelerate the work that needs to happen to deliver net zero globally. So it's a really good thing that it's been postponed by a bit. It means it can be more ambitious. We can deliver more. So that was one thing. Another thing.
Tell me that, Louise.
Yeah, just as I say, I think certainly every year we've seen the scaling up of kind of UK ambitions, and I think for this year in Glasgow there was a big focus on what might be achieved in terms of coming together, particularly with the updated transition plans from across the world, and perhaps having a bit longer to see the progress, and particularly with this year as it is, where so many things have structurally changed, then I think certainly the ambition for next year will be that much greater. And so, yeah, very much looking forward to what can be achieved at that event.
Will it be a real meeting, or will it be a virtual meeting, do you think, Ben?
It'll be a real meeting, but it depends on the health advice. And I think all the events that I'm involved with later this year in Q4, for example, there are questions about, we've got a plan for these to be virtual. Or we had, for example, the UK and Germany co-hosted the Petersburg Climate Dialogue a few weeks ago. And that was mainly virtual, although there were some in-person meetings, although everyone's spaced out 2 meters apart. So we've got a plan for all of those scenarios. But I mean, just in terms of, to illustrate the point, it takes time to get corporates to sign up to net zero commitments. Getting more corporates and financial institutions to make those commitments is a top priority. You've got to plan ahead, and November didn't give us a huge amount of time. So it gives us at least a quarter or two more to get these things through. Do you see any evidence that corporates are more or less willing to sign up to targets as a result of the coronavirus crisis? Well, Greg, maybe you have some views.
I think whether or not they are willing to, I think the key actors who impact on their decision-making will want to see that targets have real force. Clearly, the government is going to have a much bigger say in corporate life for the foreseeable future as a result of the amount of money that they're pumping into the private sector. I think, obviously there's someone else on this call who's better placed to talk about what shareholders will think, but I think people are across the board, whether it's shareholders, stakeholders, governments, are wanting to de-risk the future as much as they possibly can. And I think the greening agenda now becomes an essential part of de-risking the economy, de-risking a portfolio, de-risking a business plan. So I think companies will want to just press the fast forward button on the low carbon economy. And I think there are a number of different factors that have to come into play here, but all of them are pointing towards a green recovery. We've just got to make sure that we do it in the most efficient way and in the right order. And we do it in a way that is going to command broad support from consumers as well as shareholders. Louise.
Yeah, just to add on that, I think what we've seen so far year to date and just generally within the market is that those investors who are looking beyond just the purely financial return, so they do have a wider environmental focus or a bit more conscious in terms of the types of returns that they're looking to generate, are a bit more sticky. So certainly in terms of withdrawals and also, obviously the performance perhaps for some of these ESG-led strategies has also been quite strong, that actually investors are willing to see through the shorter term noise and are more willing to they're aware that there will be some volatility, but they're not going to kind of run for the hills, and that they will see companies who are doing the right thing when they need to. And certainly that has been key in terms of how companies position on buybacks, dividends, etc.
Back to you, Ben.
Yeah, so just some examples of corporate announcements over the last four weeks or so. You had two big IOCs announcing net zero commitments. Shell recently announcing on the 16th of April, announcing that it was going to have a net zero target for Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions by 2050, and then for Scope 3, a 65% reduction by 2050. Total, I think yesterday, had another announcement saying something similar, and that it would be net zero for Scope 3 for all of its European energy customers. I'm not sure what it said about those outside of Europe, but lots of similar announcements from Repsol, BP, which is very encouraging. these are ambitious targets.
But I think the real challenge is not the aspiration or the target for 2050. It's what are they going to do in the next 3 years? For big industrial companies, it's how do we prioritize CapEx? How do we focus our recovery business plans in the next business cycle, rather than make commitments for our successor's successor to think about. And I think, this hashtag Build Back Better really speaks volumes, not just to investors, not just to companies, but to a broader society. And I think those companies which effectively articulate their ambition and their green credentials by making very long-dated aspirational commitments without making clear how they're going to take steps towards that in the next year, 2 years, 3 years, I think will be treated with a degree of skepticism. We're all going to be thinking very carefully about taking steps in the next few months, really. And those that just want to defer the green agenda to sort of a sometime never future, I think are going to not be taken seriously.
Ben?
Absolutely. Same can be said, of course, for financial institutions as well. We had another university committing to making commitments on climate change. Harvard, we talked about Oxford last time. Harvard have said they're going to have their portfolio net zero by 2050, but they make the point that they're going to have to work with partners to figure out what that actually means and how they measure it. And so, with companies, you have a clearer way of how you can measure compatibility with net zero commitments. For financial institutions, it's a bit more up in the air, and there's a lot of debate at the moment about what are the appropriate methodologies for aligning with net zero and how you report against that. But Greg's point about long-term targets backed up by shorter-term implementation plans is critical, and I think what we'll see increasingly is companies and financial institutions being forced to behave a bit more like governments in the Paris process, where governments have to make long-term commitments and then they need to update those every 5 years, and they need to report their progress. For companies and for financial institutions, it should be the same. They should be upping their commitments and every year reporting on the progress they're making to their existing commitments. Let's
move on with your agenda.
Sure. So a bit of analysis came out from Morningstar finding that only 40% of ex-fossil fuel funds in Europe are in fact fossil fuel free, which is kind of interesting and confirms a suspicion that lots of people have had. What does it mean to be climate aligned or a fossil fuel fund, or all these different definitions that are confusing consumers. And presumably if you're investing in a ex-fossil fuel fund, you would expect it not to have any fossil fuels in it.
Louise, this is your area.
Yeah. It's something that we had seen in the market, and it's one of those things that if there's greater transparency around holdings, then investors should be able to see through. Certainly, we have a low carbon strategy that is ex-fossil fuels, and it's important to be distinct about what is and what isn't. And I think certainly some of the ratings that are coming out, some of the kind of additional frameworks, the various flags or guidelines will help to ensure that transparency. I think also the EU taxonomy will also help on the more kind of opportunity side, which I think is just as important, and kind of go back to the previous point in terms of defining Paris alignment. So something that the IGCC are working on, how that gets defined, and certainly stewardship is a big part of that we recognise that a lot of the economy isn't currently aligned, and that stewardship helps to drive that alignment. But also within the portfolio, there should be metrics on decarbonisation as well as the opportunity side, so the kind of the green revenue side. And certainly we take that approach. But also going back to the other point, in terms of celebrating their success and really advocating for the Climate Action 100 plus, and how successful that can be when investors do work together to push for a common agenda at companies. And certainly we've seen that success coming through within the European oil and gas sector.
Ben.
Yeah, a related issue and something I wanted to quiz Louise about actually was so there's the draft proposals for the EU sustainable disclosure regime have come out, and there's a bit of a kerfuffle about it because they're defining fossil fuels as only applying to solid energy sources, which means stuff like coal and lignite, but not oil and gas. And so a lot of investors, maybe Hermes, Federated Hermes is one of them, have been going, hang on, we're actually also interested in all these other fossil fuels. It's not just about coal, although of course coal is important. So that's kicked up a bit of a debate.
Louise.
Yeah, and so I think certainly kind of shades of brown is something that's important. And I think some investors are more interested in perhaps being part of the more transition so that they are happy to be part of gas investments in the next couple of years. Some would prefer to take that kind of longer term view that they don't want to be invested at all, but certainly, kind of on the kind of shades of grey, and certainly using some of the data that's out there in terms of the stranding of assets, and companies having that decarbonisation plan set out with measurable targets that are relative, not just absolute, I think are important.
Ben?
And then another thing that happened, another big thing that happened was, of course, negative oil prices, with West Texas Intermediate going into serious negative territory, as low as minus $40 a barrel, I should say. Talk about stranded assets. So I think that's another very interesting development. Of course, we're used to negative electricity prices in power markets. That's been happening for quite some time, but no one really thought it was going to happen in an oil market. So that again will, I think, affect expectations and risk preferences in the market.
Do you think it was anything other than just a sort of technical thing? Does it say anything more about the future of the oil market than that too many speculators got burned at the end of a trading month?
Well, in a sort of relatively narrow sense, I think it generates some interesting and important questions about pipelines and storage capacity in North America. And you could kind of argue it both ways. Is it going to be bullish for new pipeline capacity? People needing to get their oil to market, or is it going to be bearish in the sense that the economics of this stuff just doesn't add up as it once did? So that's a very big deal for North America. But I think it highlights. Linking back to the conversation that Louise was referring to around portfolio performance and how ESG portfolios seem to have been outperforming their benchmarks. Yeah, that's in large part because they've gone underweight the energy sector. So that seems to be the main driver of that outperformance. Again, I don't know whether Louise has any views about that.
Louise, you want to come in there?
Sure. Certainly, for a lot of strategies, that is the case. Within some of our strategies where we run sector neutral profile portfolios, that there is still some exposure, and certainly in terms of looking the longer term, those are the companies that we expect to deliver relative to their sectors. So there is still some exposure there. But I think the other thing as well is often companies with better ESG profiles are sometimes the low volatility names. But I think to a certain extent, what we've seen within the portfolios, it's the companies that are really at the forefront in terms of some of these more secular trends going forward. And I think for us, when we look at our portfolios, that's why we've seen some of the stronger performance.
Okay, move on to your agenda, Ben.
Sure. So moving on to something a bit different, the International Organization of Securities Commissions, IOSCO, published a report on sustainable finance. They established a sustainable finance network in 2018. This report's a sort of stock take of different things. They've also announced they're going to establish a board-level task force on sustainable finance to improve sustainability-related disclosures made by issuers and asset managers, and to basically foster more collaboration between their member bodies. So that was one thing. And another related thing, just sort of at at that level of international financial regulation supervision. The Basel Committee on Banking Supervision published a report on what their different members are doing on climate-related financial risks. And they also announced that they've set up a high-level task force on climate-related financial risks, the TFCR, another acronym. And that's co-chaired by Frank Elderson, who is an executive director at the Dutch Central Bank. He's also chair of the Network for Greening the Financial System. And interestingly, a senior member of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, Kevin Sturrow, both co-chairing that. So that's the sort of, and a further indication of BIS doing stuff.
What did the Basel Committee conclude on bank responsibility here?
Well, it was a stock take, so they concluded that most of their members think this is a big deal and important, and they're doing more, and they're going to think about how they do more together.
But it was at that level of generality, was it?
Yeah, judging from what I've seen, yeah. I
don't know if either Greg or Louise wants to come in on that. I'm always in awe of the Basel Committee. That's been my background. You're perhaps less impressed by it, Louise.
Well, I think to the earlier point in terms of some of the kind of the standard setting and certainly some of the expectations for companies over the next couple of years, both financial players and companies themselves obviously do lend themselves to more kind of reporting and more transparency, and I think that's something that we're in favour of. But I think in terms of looking, one of the things in terms of the standardisation that obviously is a positive more generally can lead to some kind of dislocations within the market in terms of how things get measured and managed going forward. So we're quite conscious of, yes, wanting to kind of standardise things, but also aware that for some types of companies and depending on the business profile, particularly globally, that companies will respond differently. And so we need to take a more bespoke approach when we're looking at companies.
Okay, back to you, Ben.
Yeah, and just to clarify, it's not that I was... I'm impressed that the Basel Committee looking at this. It's they're often slow to move on this kind of thing. So the stock take, they reviewed pretty much all the members of the G20 apart from India, from what I can see. And just in terms of some of the stats coming out of this report, number of respondents who have conducted research on climate-related financial risks, 24 yes, 3 no. Number that who have raised climate change with their supervised banks, 23 yes, 2 no. Number that have surveyed banks on climate-related financial risks, 18 yes, 6 no, and so on and so forth. The number that have issued supervisory guidance on climate-related financial risks, 6 yes, 5 in progress, 16 no, which in my mind suggests that more and more are going to come through that system and start to think about that. So it's worth having a quick look.
I have to say, though, I do hope that a lot of this data collection and data analysis of what financial institutions and regulatory authorities are doing will actually translate to real impacts on the ground, because the danger is this becomes a sort of like spectator sport. In my own sector, in the aluminium sector, I've been trying now for 6 months to make a very basic step forward, which is an absolute no-brainer, which is to get the London Metal Exchange to agree that every trade in aluminium on the LME should disclose its carbon footprint. So that at the moment, there's absolutely no differential for aluminium traded between Chinese aluminium with a carbon footprint, say, of 18 tons per ton of aluminium, with a ton of aluminium that we might sell from N Plus Group, from Rusal, our aluminium business, or that, say, Rio Tinto might sell, who are another low carbon producer, or Norsk Hydro might sell, which has a very, very different level of carbon footprint. But at the moment, there's no way for that immediately to be reflected in the information available, let alone the price.
Is there any precedent for that in other markets?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's got to come. Unless you start to be transparent about the carbon footprint of commodities, how on earth do you build a reliably low carbon economy through a manufacturing chain?
But aluminum is fungible, right? I mean, once it gets into the market, it can. There is no way of identifying the carbon footprint of a ingot of alumina.
Well, it is at the rolling plant. They certainly can, and we have a product that's not a problem. I mean, now with supply chain tracing, and with all the technology available, it is easy to identify where that aluminium's come from and to trace and track it. Not least because a lot of the applications things like aluminium go to are very high value, and you need to have certainty about the quality of the product that it's producing. So it's exciting that one of the biggest growth markets for aluminium now is the expansion of electric vehicles. And one of the things I think we're going to see coming out of this COVID crisis is an increase in the expansion of the electric vehicle network charging, and also a bigger or faster shift towards EVs than we were expecting before. Again, because people just want to de-risk and get to that greener future quicker. But it's got to be built on solid foundations, and that means full carbon disclosure for the commodities which are used. And so,
is that reasonable, Ben? I mean, do you think that that's doable?
Well, yes, I do. I mean, and as Greg was saying, developments in tracking, tracing, technologies, understanding supply chains and the origins of things is super important, whether it's in the sorts of products that Greg is talking about, or in soft commodities, or in agriculture. And this is important not just for climate, but also for biodiversity, nature, animal welfare in agriculture, all those things.
But also, I think the key thing is there are very few people out there, a few companies, who are opposing such a move in principle. The reason it's not happening is people are just too slow, don't want to move yet, are attached to the status quo, don't want to see business disruption. And I think there's going to be a growing impatience with that tortoise speed of change. And actually a lot of people, and hopefully investors, will push for companies to make that change coming out of the COVID crisis to a low carbon future. And actually,
Louise, are you on board with that?
Yeah, yes, we obviously do want companies to move quicker, faster, do more, but we are also conscious that this is an unprecedented business environment that companies are facing, and that they are seeing huge amounts of hurdles in terms of dealing with that business environment, and really very uncertain because of the lack of expectations from governments on what needs to happen as businesses get going again, that they can't actually do a lot of this planning. I'm not saying that the environmental issues aren't going to stay as important, but I think for this year, a lot of time the focus is going to be on some of the more social metrics, and certainly how companies think about their employees and how they bring these areas back.
Of course. I mean, employees outrank everything else in terms of importance and priority.
Ben, back to you.
Sure. Well, I mean, going back to the, what are the regulators doing? Just the last bit of information, I suppose, because this is, again, directional. It sort of highlights where I think some other supervisors will go. The Swedish financial regulator has announced that it's going to monitor Paris alignment of loan books and investment portfolios. The reason that's interesting is that most other regulators have been interested primarily in climate risk in portfolios and loan books, not necessarily Paris alignment. And they aren't the same thing. They kind of overlap, but they're not the same thing necessarily. So that's kind of an interesting development. Another example of some leadership coming out of Sweden on these topics.
What else is on your agenda?
So occasionally we have agenda items around M&A activity in the kind of the data, ESG data world. Morningstar acquired the rest of Sustainalytics, which was fairly big news for the sector. That was 170 million euros. They owned a large stake in it, and are now own all of it, I understand. They're used by a lot of people. I don't know whether Federated Hermes use Sustainalytics. They might do.
I would assume they do, don't they?
Yeah, we use a range of different providers. I think to a certain extent we'd like to see more competition within this space, particularly.
Does that increase competition or decrease it, Morningstar buying Sustainalytics?
So I think Morningstar buying Sustainalytics, I mean, they've been working together now for a number of years, will elevate companies' awareness of some of these issues and the fact that investors want companies to fulfill certain kind of minimum standard criteria in terms of transparency and in terms of what they're doing. And hopefully to a certain extent in terms of some of the awareness and the standard setting that then kind of goes through into the more kind of retail investment landscape as well. And we start to see more assets being thought about within an ESG type framework, perhaps in a more detailed way. And I think the fact that Sustainalytics obviously now have a bigger parent behind them, also we expect, that they'll be ramping up the research that they do, how they cover companies, how they cover themes, some of those things. So there'll be more extended, more detailed research out there that we can consume and, either support and move on to the next thing or kind of dive into a bit more detail and go off on a tangent in a different way.
Okay, let me ask Greg and Louise both what they think we might have missed. This is a very quick tour d'horizon of what's been going on over the last month. Greg, are there things that you feel that we have underplayed or missed?
Sorry, in this conversation?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I don't think there's anything that particularly stands out. I mean, what I am interested in and don't have the answer is where if people feel that this whole green recovery, build back better agenda is anything more than a sort of great hashtag on Twitter, or whether it's really gaining traction with both the private sector and with government policymakers. And I'd be interested to know what Ben thinks, given the huge amount of information that he distills and sees, that from his perspective, how optimistic is he that this is a real thing and not just a sort of Twitter sphere aspiration?
Ben?
Yeah, so I guess two things. One is there was a study that colleagues at Oxford published yesterday. They got a bit of traction, but also colleagues at Columbia and LSE. So it was some big names. Stiglitz was on it. Stern was on it. Colleague at Oxford, Cameron Hepburn, was on it. Basically, they had interviewed 220 or something financial policymakers, central bankers around the world about, what are the things they should be doing to support the recovery. And a lot of those respondents said, well, you should be doing clean energy infrastructure investment. You should be doing energy efficiency. You should be doing all the building back better stuff. And that is, in fact, the best way of ensuring an effective recovery, which is kind of interesting. And then I think the second point is that, yes, I do. I do think there's a lot of momentum in that direction. I think a lot of it's will be about resilience, though. And I think from every level, from the individual householder, how do you make your own home more resilient? For example, through energy efficiency improvements, decentralized renewables, through to complex global supply chains and reshoring. I think that's going to drive a lot of the kind of the policy making. And all of that can generate an awful lot of investment. And a lot of that investment can, of course, be aligned with climate outcomes. So I think we'll see more of that resilience framing in everything.
From just in time to just in case. Louise, what have we missed?
Two things I was going to just highlight. So just yesterday, I think a report came out from TPI, the Transition Pathway Initiative on the mining sector, and highlighting how only 2 companies are actually kind of defined according to that framework as Paris aligned. So a lot of work to be done within that sector, and certainly we would highlight that as a very good framework for rolling that out to other sectors to question them in terms of what they're doing and setting the framework. And we've also aligned our voting policy, our engagement strategy behind that framework as well, really as a way of tracking companies and ensuring that engagement does have end goals and it is moving quick enough. So that's one area that I think definitely highlighting through this voting season. And secondly, we've seen lots of companies coming out with transition bonds, and so a huge amount of new capital going into companies accelerating, and so kind of very supportive of particularly some of the big tech companies that are recognising their contribution and how they can help. For instance, on aluminium for Apple, that they can really get to the next phase in terms of efficiency and sorting out kind of some of the roadblocks that they see within their business model. And obviously investors wanting to get access to that green return as well.
What are you going to be concentrating on over the next month, Ben? And what should we be all looking for over the next month?
Well, more of the same. It all kind of disappears into much of a muchness, really. Getting up, doing video calls, writing, looking forward to the end of the lockdown. But just to quickly come back on Louise's point, I think, and Greg's question, the Overton window is obviously shifted, and I think that's not just in the public sector, that is in the private sector as well. And there's going to be much more appetite for big solutions. And I do think that a lot of the stuff we were talking about and key people were talking about before all of this, for example, let's do more disclosure, let's do more TCFD. It's kind of it's really kind of small fry relative to the challenges. And I think that distinction between what actually makes a difference, what's actually important, and what's just a bit of stuff on the side, I think is going to be much clearer in all of this.
The final word should be with you as a politician, Greg. As soon as I hear the term Overton window, I think immediately of Parliament. The Overton window, does anything that's happened permit bigger ideas to go through it over the next couple of months, in your opinion?
Well, I hope so. I think for business, we're still in the middle of the storm. And those of us at board level with strategic responsibilities clearly have a duty to be thinking about what comes next, how we drive our group forward. But we're still very much in the middle of a crisis. In parts of the world, this epidemic hasn't yet peaked. And we're very mindful of the human consequences and impacts that's having. So for me personally, that immediate handling of the crisis is the most pressing thing I still have. But I'm still trying to think and trying to find bandwidth to think about what comes next. And like Ben, try and be optimistic about the future. I genuinely think there's going to be a leap forward because people will take a different attitude to risk. Climate change is the biggest existential risk that we face long term, apart from this, these ghastly pandemics. So I think there is an alignment of interest there.
Okay, can I thank Lord Barker? Can I thank Louise Dudley? And of course, as always, can I thank Ben Caldecott? And of course, can I thank all of you for watching? Many, many thanks. I hope we see you again next month.
Thank you.
Thank you.